We can in this let's start with the actual configuration of the site. In the previous demo, you have seen that at the root of an ASP.NET Core application, we had two very important files, namely the program.cs and the startup.cs. As mentioned in the demo, these two classes have a very distinct task in the lifecycle of an ASP.NET Core application. The program class in our application contains a main function, as you can see here. This may sound a bit weird, but yes, an ASP.NET Core application is in fact a console application, and therefore it contains a main function that will execute. Although for our application we won't really have to change anything in this class, it's interesting to know what's happening here. In the main function, a host is being set up, which will configure a server and a request processing pipeline. We are calling createDefaultBuilder, which will set up the application with some defaults. One of the things that it'll do is configuring a web server called Kestrel. By default, your ASP.NET Core 2 application is thus hosted by this internal web server. Typically, you will still access the site over IIS, and that link is also enabled by default here. Another very important thing that is happening here is that we are specifying the startup class using the useStartup method. We are passing as type parameter the startup class, which will be the type that actually performs the startup, or I should better say the configuration of the application. In the startup class, we will actually be doing two things: defining the request pipeline and configuring all services that we need throughout the application. The startup class is required to define two methods which will be automatically invoked. These are the configure services and the configure methods. In configure services, we will be registering services for our application. Now let me explain this in a little bit more detail, since it is crucial to understand. ASP.NET Core uses a simple built-in dependency injection system. Through dependency injection, we can achieve a loosely coupled architecture within our application. Instead of instantiating classes directly, dependencies will be injected into the consuming classes. We'll see how exactly this is done later in the course, but most of the time, this will be by passing dependencies through the constructor. This approach is then called constructor injection. ASP.NET Core comes thus with a built-in dependency injection container, a component that will be helping us to register and retrieve dependencies. This container is available through the iService Provider interface, and the services collection you see here as a parameter is the collection of services it manages. We can, in this configure services method, therefore add services to the collection of services managed in the application. Now, services is a very broad term, and it is in fact exactly that. Services are objects that have a certain functionality for other parts within the application. We'll be able to register system services as well as our own, which we will be doing later in this course. In the configure method, the request pipeline will be set up. Now, the request pipeline consists out of a number of components chained behind one another. These are the so-called middleware components. These components will, let's say, intercept or handle an incoming HTTP request. Each component will be able to alter the request, or by the way, also the response can be altered, or simply pass it on to the next component in the request pipeline. Here in the sample code, we are registering 4 middleware components. Along the way through this course, we will be registering more middleware components. First, I'm using Use Developer Exception page. Enabling this will therefore enable a page that is comparable with the yellow screen of that page that we had in previous versions of ASP.NET. The useStatusCode pages method will add support for text-only headers for common status codes. UseStaticFiles is another middleware component I'm registering here, and that will enable the ability for my site to serve static files such as images and CSS files. Finally, UseMVC with default route sets up MVC middleware using the default routing schema. This may sound a bit confusing, but don't fear, we will explain all of this in much more detail throughout this course. Since these components will be in a pipeline, the order in which they get added is important here. Typically, your call to the MVC middleware component needs to be at the end of the pipeline. So to summarize, when an ASP.NET Core 2 application is starting, quite a few things are set in motion. The application starts with the call to the main function in the program class. There, we specified which was our startup class using the useStartup call. In the startup class, first the configure services method is called automatically by the system, and that allows us to register services that we'll want to use in our application. Then the configure method is called, where the request pipeline is set up. After that, our application is up and running and is able to handle incoming requests. Now that we know how an ASP.NET Core application starts, let's return to the demo and configure our site. So here's a program class, which is of course in the program.cs file. An ASP.NET Core application is now in fact a console application. So that means that an ASP.NET Core application now has a static void main. It may still sound a little bit weird, I totally understand. In the static void main, there's a call to build web host, which will basically set up the environment. In the build web host, we are calling create default builder on the web host class. The latter does quite a few things. Let's take a look at the documentation for this method. As mentioned, the create default builder will do some setup for the application based on some defaults. One of the things it will do is it will create Castrol, a built-in web server that actually runs your ASP.NET Core application. Although your ASP.NET Core application runs on an internal web server, it can still be used in combination with IIS using IIS integration. That's another thing that Create Default Builder will do. It will set up this integration. There's quite some other things that Create Default Builder will do for you, and we'll come across some of the other defaults that will be set up by this method later in this course. Next is a very important call to use startup by default in here, and it's pointing us to the startup type. This will basically specify the startup class as the startup type for our application. Let's take a look at the startup next. Here you